Okay, now it's my pleasure to introduce our author today. David Pietrusza is the author of 1920, The Year of the Six Presidents. He holds both a bachelor's and master's degree in history from the University at Albany. He has served on the City Council in Amsterdam, New York, and as a public information officer for both the Governor's Office of Regulatory Reform and the Office of Medicaid Inspector General for the state of New York. He has produced a number of critically acclaimed works concerning the 20th century American history, including 1960, LBJ and JFK versus Nixon, the epic campaign that forged 3 presidencies, and Rothstein, the life, times, and murder of the criminal genius who fixed the 1919 World Series. He has appeared on such media outlets as C-SPAN, C-SPAN Book TV, C-SPAN American History TV, the History Channel, NPR, and the Fox News Channel. So let's please welcome our author.
Thank you. First off, the year of the 6 presidents, some folks may not know which 6 I'm referring to, but in that year, you've got TR, who would be the president, except that he's dead, but if he's not dead, a small point, he will be the next president. Wilson, who really wants to be president again. People don't remember this, but that's true. Harding, who makes it. Coolidge, there's a boomlet for him. He's running for vice president. Hoover, who's not sure if he's a Republican or a Democrat, and wins 2 primaries, Democratic primaries. And Franklin D. Roosevelt, who runs that year for Vice President of the United States. And I don't really need to, I think, introduce FDR to this crowd, so we will sort of cut to the chase to where he is going into that, and where he is in Washington as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. There's a thing called World War I going on, and there are a couple of other incidents which are going to show up during that 1920 presidential campaign. So we'll talk about them instead of World War I. One of which is Haiti. The United States has been in the business now of interfering in Central America. There was an excursion into Mexico, occupation of Nicaragua, Santo Domingo, and Haiti. And as Undersecretary of the Navy, Franklin Roosevelt oversees the occupation. There's a guy named Smedley Darlington Butler, some of you may know that name, who's running the show in Haiti, and they play rough. There's eventually a 40,000 person armed revolt in Haiti. 2,000 to 3,000 Haitians are killed by our troops, and the other side kills 13 of our guys, which some people say, this tells you what's really going on. It's a series of massacres. And Butler tells FDR, it would be good not to inquire too closely as to how we get our road program done, because it's all forced labor. He doesn't say that last part, but that's what he means. So Haiti's a bit of a, not exactly a stellar page in the history books of the country. Also, what's going on that year is, in his tenure, is he had worked in 1912 with a guy named Thomas Mott Osborne on the Wilson campaign. Wilson was from upstate New York, Auburn, and he goes undercover in Auburn prison. And he's Tom Brown, prisoner 33333X. Writes a book about it. Big prison reformer. They make him warden of Sing Sing. And then FDR makes him, and Josephus Daniels, the Secretary of the Navy, makes Osborne warden of the Portsmouth Naval Prison. Sounds like a good choice. Except that in 1915, Osborne had been indicted for absenteeism, perjury, general incompetence, and unlawful and unnatural acts. Yeah, we know what that means, okay? He's a reformer, and he lets a lot of guys who normally you'd just say, here's your dishonorable discharge, don't come back on the ships. The Navy doesn't like this, the officers don't like this, the men don't like it. A lot of stuff, aside from those acts, there's also a lot of stuff missing on board ships. And Roosevelt supports Osborne. He gets into a debate with a Captain Taussig, which goes very public, and eventually Taussig is shut down. But we're going to come back to Mr. Osborne later during the campaign, as we will with Haiti. What's really in the lead up then is people are also starting to talk about Franklin Roosevelt for president. Not a lot of people, but some people. The Republican New York Sun is. There's articles in the Boston paper saying that the Boston politicians are thinking about it. So it's in the air. He's a young man on the way up. And another young man on the way up is the aforementioned Mr. Hoover. The Hoovers and the Roosevelts are friends. FDR says, I think he'd be a great president. He is a wonder about Hoover. And one day, some guys in the administration, a guy named Lewis Well, who was the nephew of Judge Brandeis, is shooting the breeze about, what are we going to do? 1920 doesn't look like a good year for the Democrats. Oh. How about a Hoover-Roosevelt ticket? They're administration guys, but yet they're young, fresh faces. You got one guy from New York, you got one guy from California. Those were big in the 16 election. You know, we could have won New York, and if we didn't win California, we were, out the door. Hoover, Roosevelt. Well goes to FDR. FDR goes, nah, this isn't our year. I don't think so. And Well goes, yes, don't worry about it if you lose. They will not hold it against you. You will make contacts. You will learn things. You can overcome it if we lose. And FDR goes, well, okay, it might be a good stepping stone. Go see Hoover. Before he sees Hoover, Well sees Colonel House, Wilson's assistant, his gray eminence. And House says, okay, go ahead. I love it. Might be our only chance to win. He goes, sees to Hoover. Well goes, sees Hoover in his lower Manhattan offices. Hoover is like, he's like looking down. He's like, well, I don't know if I want to get involved with the bosses. And, he doesn't even look. He's like doodling with a pencil. And Well goes, look, you want to be in politics? You take it as it is. You take as it is, and you get in touch with Colonel House. And he does, but nothing comes of it. And of course, Hoover becomes a Republican. Democrats have to nominate someone. FDR goes to the convention, gets into a little kerfuffle on the floor, grabbing the standard and marching around, sort of creating a show. He's been, the anti-Tammany guy upstate. He's not in good graces with the ruling clique of the New York State Democratic Party, which really is by the numbers Tammany down in Manhattan. Eventually, a guy named James M. Cox of Ohio, newspaper editor, is nominated for the presidency. And Cox has an idea right off the bat. He is thinking Franklin Roosevelt for vice president. Now, there'd been some other things going back and forth during the convention. Maybe Roosevelt could run for senator. Tammany's thinking maybe running him for senator just because they don't like the former socialist mayor of Schenectady who'd be running. He'd be even worse than Franklin Roosevelt. You don't want Lund. We'll take Roosevelt, and we'll see what happens. I don't know. But so they've been thinking about it. Cox says, okay, Roosevelt. He's a Roosevelt. Can't hurt. He's from New York again. He's been in the administration. I haven't. It can bring the non-administrations, the administration people together. And, Cox basically looks like a Ohio Midwestern sack of potatoes. And Franklin Roosevelt is an Ivy League Adonis. He has been compared to the great stage actor William Faversham. And if you know William Faversham, you know this guy's a looker. This guy's a star. So it's like, let's go with Roosevelt. But first we got to run it past Tammany because these guys have been at loggerheads in their careers. Tammany says, you're the first guy who's ever asked me what I thought about anything on the national stage. Charles Francis Murphy, the boss. And in a way, he wants to get Roosevelt out of New York, the same way that Boss Platt wanted to get TR out of New York, so he'd make someone vice president. That didn't work out too well for Platt, but maybe it would work out for FDR. And okay, he can go on the ticket. They have what back then Franklin Roosevelt broke that tradition in 32, flying to the convention, giving the acceptance speech there. Before, you'd go to the guy's hometown, president, vice president, and he'd give a speech weeks afterwards. Roosevelt goes up to Dayton, Ohio. Cox gives his speech, 20,000 words. They have a big parade, they march down the street, but nobody shows up. McAdoo, Smith, Bryan, A. Mitchell Palmer, all the contenders, the big men of the party, don't show up for this event. It's not going to be a good year. Roosevelt comes back here about a week later. He's smarter. He gives a 3,500-word speech. People like that speech. People actually show up for that speech. Not as many as in Dayton. 5,000 people showed up. They trampled Sarah's lawn to smithereens. The bad news was he had invited 15,000 people, and they had to sort of bring in the hired help to, fill in the crowd on the lawn. But the speech generally gets very good grades. Roosevelt and Cox then make another trip, and it's to the White House to see the very incapacitated Woodrow Wilson. And this has a big effect on the campaign. Cox shows up in a nice gray suit. Roosevelt looks very spiffy in blue blazer, white pants, white shoes. And they see Wilson, who is in a blanket in August, because he's in bad shape. Cox is so moved at the really pathetic shape that Wilson is in that he pledges undying support to the League of Nations, which he hadn't been crazy about before. And when they, actually this preceded the announcement in Dayton, and when Cox gives that talk, he says the whole campaign is going to be about the League, which basically sinks their chances into nothing. So Frank is really running in a doomed race, but he thinks he has some chances, thinks he's going to do some good. Very energetic candidate, goes out on a train called the Westboro, but the campaign has no money. He has to kick in $5,000 of his own cash to get it up and started. Sarah, his mother, kicks in another $3,000. He puts the team together, Steve Early, Louis Howe, people like that, Eleanor, and they go off. On the campaign trail, Eleanor kind of gets her sea legs for the first time. Howe takes her under his wing, and she learns how to speak in public, and she has her beginnings in this race, really, politically, even though he's run for office a couple times in very small potato sort of ways, or unsuccessful ways. Now, Roosevelt swings all the way around the country, and he ends up in Montana and the Pacific coasts, and the League of Nations is an issue. And people say, what kind of deal did Woodrow Wilson get? We're going to have one vote. One vote. And the British are going to have them, the Canadians, the Indians, the Australians, New Zealand, South Africa. They're going to have 6 votes. We got hornswoggled again. Uncle Sap. And Franklin goes, no, we won't. We can count on the votes of all these Central American republics. We'll just tell them what to do, and it's like, okay. And while we're on the subject, I pretty much ran Haiti during the war, and Santo Domingo, and I wrote that constitution of theirs, and it's a pretty good constitution. This is not what you're supposed to say in diplomatic circles. So this gets reported by the Associated Press. Franklin does the only moral and reputable thing one can do in diplomacy, which is to deny he ever said it. Warren Harding runs a newspaper in Marion, Ohio, and he writes an editorial saying, well, this is pretty bad. People are dying, Haitians and Americans, so this guy can write constitutions and all that. This is no good. Roosevelt says, didn't you read my denial? I denied that. Did you miss that, Warren? And Warren says, oh, I'm sorry, I apologize, and I hope that all the papers will give the equal amount of ink to my apology as to my accusation. Senator William E. Borah of Idaho, the great progressive and isolationist, then issues a statement. He says, yes, this FDR, this Franklin Roosevelt statement in Butte, where he says that he wrote this Constitution and running these republics, and he denies it. And I'm perfectly willing and able to say he didn't say it, except that I was there and I heard him say it. A month later, they come up, the administration comes up, or not the administration, but the Republicans, get 31 citizens of Butte to say, I was there, and the Associated Press account is essentially correct. But by that time, it's old news. Roosevelt basically gets away with that. There's also another interesting situation going on there, where he goes out to Centralia, Washington. There had been what is now considered to be a very infamous massacre and lynching of IWW people. There was a kind of a shootout between them and American legionnaires. And Roosevelt gives a statement which completely ignores the IWW lynching and says the American Legion is speaking out against anarchism and Bolshevism and all sorts of things like that. And it is in support of their actions. One thing I neglected to mention about the convention is this, and it's, I think, indicative of the state of the Roosevelt marriage at that point. After Roosevelt is nominated, after he's nominated, and he is so young. He is so young that the fellow who's going to put his name in nomination says, "How old are you?" And Franklin says 38. And the guy says, okay, fine, because 35 is the constitutional limit. And Roosevelt says, should I stick around for the speech? He says, no, I'd leave the hall if I were you, and don't come back. And Roosevelt, for once, listens. He listens, does not give an acceptance speech at the hall. Josephus Daniels does, his boss. Daniels had been undercut in many, many ways by Roosevelt during the war. And at one point, Roosevelt gives a talk, February 1st, 1920, actually after the war, bragging about how he had done enough illegal acts to put us into preparedness for the war to land him in jail for 999 years. He says he opposed Wilson on many things, that he was responsible for hiring Admiral Sims to run the Navy, and that he had unauthorized put into the Navy $40 million before it was authorized by anyone. All of which was baloney. And it's remarkable that Daniels always put up with him. And at one point, he was going to go to the White House and complain about this speech. And Wilson, on his own, very sick at that time, goes off on FDR because FDR had had the British ambassador over to his house for dinner. This is what Wilson was concentrating on. And working for the embassy was a guy who had been spreading gossip about Wilson and his first wife. And Daniels, who no matter what FDR did, was always very supportive of him. Must have been like a father-son relationship. Says, I better not bring up this Brooklyn speech that Roosevelt gave, or Wilson would fire him on the spot. And he didn't want that. He just wanted him disciplined. He said, FDR persona non grata with Wilson. Back to the convention. Back to that convention again. After Roosevelt is nominated, Daniels and FDR go off to the battleship New Mexico. That's where they're staying. They couldn't get a hotel room, so they're staying in the battleship. which first FDR wanted to use, and then Daniels pulled rank on him. And they go out for dinner there, and it is very interesting that there's a telegraph sent to Eleanor informing her of FDR's nomination. And it's not sent by FDR, it's sent by Daniels. And this may explain her statement about the nomination, which says, "I could not get very excited about it," which is also very consistent with her statement about his election in 1922 and her reaction to his nomination for the presidency in 1932, which was somewhat violent, as we know, that I'm going to run off with Earl Miller. And so, again, Roosevelt back on the campaign trail, and there is that year something else going on. And it's not with that Norfolk naval prison, but there's something else going on with personnel, and it's in the same neighborhood. When they geared up for World War I, Newport, the Newport Naval Base, had 2,000 sailors stationed there. They put that up to 25,000 during the war, and they didn't have any place for them to live. They stayed in boarding houses, probably basements, spare rooms. Naval discipline falls completely apart. And there is, drinking, drugs, prostitution, and this has got to be looked into it. The Navy Department gets a complaint from the governor of Rhode Island, Livingston Beekman, and says, please look into this. So they do. And they're looking into prostitution, not only heterosexual prostitution. They're looking into homosexual, gay prostitution as well. So they start an investigation, and what happens is a captain, Harvard graduate named Erastus Meade Hudson, hires about a dozen sailors to do whatever they have to do to get to the bottom of the of gay sex, gay prostitution in Newport. They arrest about 18 sailors. Most of them are thrown out of the service, but the complaints still continue from the people in Rhode Island. They say we need to do more. Hudson is recruited a seaman's mate named Irwin Arnold, and they go off again to the Navy Department to try to get authorization for more investigations. When they do that, FDR passes the request over to the Justice Department because they're asking not to investigate sailors, they're asking to investigate civilians. The Justice Department says, we're busy. We don't want to do this. FDR hands it over to an admiral named Niblack. Niblack says, I don't want any part of this. They take it back to FDR, and FDR creates Section A, Office of the Assistant Secretary, and basically says, you guys are in business, Captain Hudson, seaman's mate Arnold, okay? And you will receive no further orders in writing. Completely hush-hush. What they do is they recruit, I think it's 41 sailors, some 10 of them between the ages of 16 and 19, to go to the limit. To go to the limit to trap people in homosexual sex, civilians. They arrest about 10. One of them is the chaplain of the Naval Hospital, an Episcopal clergyman named Samuel Neal Kent. They take him to trial, and the judge, people are pretty much aghast at what the Navy's done. Even on the ground, people in Newport who said, we got a problem. We got trouble in River City, okay? But we don't want stuff like this going on. We don't want entrapment things going on. We don't want sending young sailors out to do this, okay? And they decide to bring him to trial again. The Navy tracks down the Reverend Kent in Battle Creek, Michigan, where he's had sort of a nervous breakdown, and they send sailors out, and they grab him, and they bring him all the way back to Providence, Rhode Island. He is tried again. Two sailors testify that they were told, go the limit in getting evidence, and that it goes to the jury. He is acquitted in 3 hours. 3 hours. People are aghast at what was happening. Franklin Roosevelt denies that he gave any orders for this. It appears that this is not the case. There is a Senate subcommittee of the Navy Committee set up. A senator from Delaware, a senator from New Hampshire, a senator from Utah, 2 Republicans, a Democrat, and they decide to investigate what really happened. This is as his vice presidential campaign is in the works. This investigation is going on during the presidential campaign. They hold hearings in secret. There's very little publicity against Franklin Roosevelt that occurs in this case. Now, why? Is it because Republicans are just nicer guys? Okay, we don't want to bring this up during the campaign. Maybe they were just embarrassed. It's like, well, how do we handle this case? I don't know. This is not normally what we talk about. Or is it because they had nominated Warren Harding? And if you go here, maybe it's going to go around. I don't know. And remember, not at this time, but the aforementioned Senator Borah in 1922, he has a child by Alice Roosevelt Longworth. Okay? Sex is nothing new in Washington or anywhere else, or in politics. So, this is all bubbling around. There's a Navy investigation which has been described by historians who have really studied this to be a complete whitewash. They do not bring, they say, oh, Captain Hudson, he's not feeling well. He doesn't have to testify. And the guy heading the inquiry is someone who had gone on vacation with Roosevelt to the Azores, okay, a close pal. So it is a whitewash. And this is all percolating below the surface. And then what we have is the fellow who had really started this off was the editor of the Providence Journal. He's the one who grabbed the governor by the lapels and said, get the Navy involved in this. And has been going back and forth with Roosevelt the whole time. All of a sudden shifts gears, still sort of on the same page with a different paragraph, and attacks Roosevelt for Thomas Mott Osborne at Portsmouth Naval Prison, accusing Roosevelt of destroying evidence in the case. This is in October 1920, just before the election. He sends to Newburgh, Roosevelt is campaigning at Newburgh, he sends one of his minions out to hand carry a letter to FDR accusing him of this, and then this goes out to all the Republican newspaper editors in the country. Roosevelt is outraged. He says, you are trying to blacken my reputation as a candidate, and I could sue you for this. This is unconscionable. This should be investigated by the government. And in fact, the Department of Justice investigates this guy very quickly. And of course, you know, the whole idea of campaigns is to blacken the reputation of candidates. So I'm not quite sure what FDR is getting at there. But this goes around, and on late October, in October the 20s, that range of the month, the vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, Franklin D. Roosevelt, brings a $500,000 libel suit against John Ratham, editor of the Providence Journal, against 2 functionaries of the Republican National Committee. And this is how his campaign for the vice presidency ends. Now, we know that it was a bloodbath in November. The Republicans carried just about every state. They carried every state outside the Solid South. Franklin D. Roosevelt on the ticket in New York did precious little to help the Democratic Party. Harding and Coolidge carry the city of New York, and beyond that, they carry 149 of 150 assembly districts. The only one they don't carry is Al Smith's on the Lower East Side. But the moral of this is, even though I've chronicled Haiti and naval prisons and Newport naval bases and alliances with Herbert Hoover that don't work, that this is a campaign where Roosevelt basically is falling upward. Things don't quite work out for him, except in the grand scheme of things, they do. As Roosevelt is preparing to run for president in 1932, he gets a visitor to the executive mansion in Albany. As often the case, he receives people in bed. And the visitor is Lewis Well. Remember him? He was the guy who said, Hoover, FDR, ticket. Okay? And this Well shows up for a visit, and FDR has all these index cards laid out in front of him, on top of him, all over him on the bed. Come on in. And he says, these are the index cards from my 1920 vice presidential campaign. And we built these, we use these as the building blocks, the nucleus, that is his exact words, the nucleus of my campaign today. So in fact, Franklin Roosevelt recognized that even though he had run and lost, in fact, he had run and won in the long term from 1920 to 1932. Thank you. I will now attempt to evade your questions. Do I have a bidder? Yes. Yeah, Tammany is the machine which is, Tammany was founded by Aaron Burr. That's how old that was. And it's at the peak of its powers at the beginning of the 20th century. That was Boss Tweed, of course. Before that, Smith is a product of it. Senator Wagner is a product of it. They're capable of putting up decent front men or decent candidates when they need to. They also put up Mayor James J. Walker. Getting ahead of the story, one of the things which helps make Roosevelt in 32 and which holds him back from liberal, intellectual, kind of upper class support before the convention is this Tammany, Jimmy Walker scandals. Roosevelt ducks them from 30 and 31 because he's walking on a tightrope. It's like, I can't look like I'm allied with these guys for the rest of the country, and I really don't like them anyway. On the other hand, they control all the votes in the state. And Roosevelt, in 1932, it's an uninstructed state, or slate of delegates, which goes to Chicago. He does not control his own state, which is almost unique for a successful candidate. He also does not control his section of the country, the Northeast, where Al Smith dominates in that. He's a candidate of the West and of the South, Warm Springs. Now, Tammany, he fights them in 1911 when he gets to the Senate and for the U.S. Senate seat, because the legislatures then would nominate a U.S. senator. He leads that fight, and that's what really makes him a statewide, national figure, and that's what brings Louis Howe into the picture. Howe is reporting for a newspaper. He's building up Roosevelt, and becomes his man. Next. Okay.
Just to add to the sleaze factor of the 1920 election, could you talk a little bit about Warren G. Harding, Nan Britton, all that fun and games?
Oh yeah. Well, that's because I got FDR. You know, in a way, I'm lucky. I thought after it's like, oh, these other guys have to squeeze an entire book into 30 minutes. I only have to squeeze 1/6 of it. So now Harding is, the Nan Britton thing is that's where the president's daughter comes in. And he has this daughter, illegitimate child, who I wish someone would run a DNA test on that, because who really knows? Who knows? Because a lot of wild stuff came out with Gaston Means and just stuff that wasn't true about him. It would be ironic if, in fact, this wasn't true and it only came out after his death when he couldn't defend himself, etc., etc. But he was also having an affair with the wife of the local dry goods store owner in Marion, Ohio. And this is really more interesting because, like FDR is suing someone for libel during a campaign. Warren Harding is actually being blackmailed during a presidential campaign because his mistress is ticked off because it's like, what do you mean I'm not going to the White House? What do you mean Florence is going to the White House? Remember me? I was the fun one. Okay? And her husband is in on this, okay? And it's been a pretty progressive town. And they determined to blackmail Harding. And they are paid off with cash, and they are paid off with a trip to the Orient, because there's some wonderful dry goods out there, and they're not to come back until after the election. So yeah, there's a lot of problems with Harding then. And at the end of the campaign, that October was pretty wild. A guy named Chancellor in Ohio publishes these very crude handbills alleging that Warren Harding is of black blood, that he is a mulatto or octoroon or something. And this goes all over the United States of America. The question is not that he does it, but the question is, who gets 500,000 pieces of material all around the country? Who gets it out on freight cars and passenger trains out to San Francisco? It's not this crackpot. There's somebody in back of them. I don't think it's Cox. I don't think it's Wilson. But I do think it is the, as far as I can tell, the Ohio Democratic Party. Yeah. Next. Oh, I saw that one first, and then you. The question is, what is the best alliance he forms as Assistant Secretary of the Navy? Probably with Daniel. Well, aside from Lucy? Daniels is probably the main one, because he keeps getting him from getting fired, really. Nobody else would have put up with it. Long term, I'm not quite sure. But I mean, getting him down to Washington, again, just by itself, puts him in another network. I mean, there's only so far you can get from the New York State Senate. And I think that he has to get out of the New York State Senate, because getting in 1910, it's a fluke. In 1912, even though he's sick, okay, we posit that, he barely wins. In 1914, as Bill James, the baseball guy, used to say, the plexiglass factor, that's coming back. They're going to sweep him out. In fact, we haven't had another Democrat senator from Poughkeepsie until the current one, as far as I can tell, right? And Hyde Park never votes for him again, really. So he's got to, it's the whole, I think, nexus of being in Washington, because a lot of his people are really New York based, whether it's Howe or going back to the Brain Trust. So I think that's the best I can do on that one. You were up next, and then you. Okay, well, okay, one more. That's you. Yeah. Yeah, that's the premise of the book or one of them. That's the year of the 6 presidents. He's weary. You know, his son Quentin has died in the war. That takes a lot of the steam out of him. He was very ill from the trips to the Amazon. He also had said to his sister, when he was a young man, I am going to live life to the hilt until I am like 62 years old. Yeah, dangerous number to me. And although I'm 63. So, and then that's it. And that was it. But if he is not, the Republican Party has patched things up. He will be the nominee, and he will be elected, because in 1920, the Republicans could elect Warren Harding. So yeah, it's one of those years. So thank you all for coming.